This is the Almost Timely newsletter for the week of April 28th, 2024. Content authenticity statement: 100% of this week's newsletter was generated by me, the human. There's a link at the top of the newsletter to learn why this kind of disclosure is a good idea and might be required for anyone doing business in any capacity with the EU in the near future. You will, however, see in the opening section a demo using Google's Gemini, but that generated content is not in the newsletter. So, what's on my mind this week? Building a synthetic data set. Jesper asked me on YouTube this past week if I'd ever done a tutorial or walkthrough of building a synthetic data set using generative AI. I've covered this lightly in the past, but mostly in passing. First, let's talk about why you would even want to do such a thing. Synthetic data sets, which is basically machine made data, they have a bunch of different uses. If you are working with, say, incredibly sensitive data, but you need to collaborate with others, maybe you're working with healthcare data, you might want to generate a data set that has the characteristics of your data, but none of the valuable information. For example, you might be working with user data, financial data, uh, national security data, all data sets that are highly regulated and protected for good reason. You cannot share that information with unauthorized people, but you might need them to work on the data sets. You would create a synthetic data set that they could then work with. Another reason for synthetic data sets is to supplement existing data. Everyone and their cousin is all in on generative AI, but once you start talking about tuning models and customizing them, it becomes blatantly obvious most organizations just don't have enough data to get statistically meaningful results from the process. Synthetic data, patterned on your existing data, can boost the amount of data you have available to use. A third reason is, and this is the tricky one, regulatory requirements. Under legislation like GDPR, the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, if you collected data for one purpose, you can't go using it for another purpose. If you collected emails and email marketing engagement data for email marketing purposes, you're aligned with what the user gave consent for. If you were to take that data and use it for generative AI model training, nope, that is not permitted under GDPR. You would have to go back to all your users and ask them permission for that specific purpose. But if you created a synthetic data set that mimicked your existing data but had none of the actual data in it, you're good to go. You can use the synthetic data for training models. Your reasons for using synthetic data will largely dictate how you go about generating it. For just not having enough data, generating more of the same kind of data is a very straightforward task. For having data you can't share due to privacy and sensitivity, you have to go through some statistical processes first. And for adhering to regulatory requirements, that is definitely the most tricky use case of all. So, with that backdrop, let's go ahead and look at the process of creating synthetic data. We'll start with the easiest use case first, just making more stuff. Let's say you have a data set and you just need more of it. The first question to ask is, are there patterns in the data that you need to replicate, or you just need more of the stuff in general? For example, suppose you want to create a large caption data set of Instagram captions, fine tuning a language model on what social media content looks like or what social media sentiment looks like. You could take a existing data set and hand it to a model like Google Gemini and say, make more of this. In fact, let's go ahead and do exactly this. So here is Google Gemini, and I have asked it, what are the basic best practices for creating synthetic data? And then I said, I'm going to provide you with unstructured text data, captions from Instagram. First, I want you to analyze it. I have a data set I've prepared of some of the top performing posts from a recent week on Instagram. There's a good amount of information here. Let's see how much it is. 66,000 tokens. That is about 40,000 words. Let's see what Gemini has to say about this particular data set. Okay, so Gemini has spit out a whole bunch of stuff. It has said, hey, here's my analysis of this caption data. There's a diversity of users, content themes, linguistic features, and so on and so forth. Now say, great, let's go ahead now and using this training data set as a template, generate 10 social media posts, 10 Instagram, be specific. Let's call it 10 net new Instagram captions that mimic training data set. Sample randomly to capture the diversity of the training data set. Let's see what happens. All right, let's see what happened here. We have Google's Gemini making synthetic Instagram captions. Here's 10 new Instagram captions generated based on the patterns and themes observed in the training data. Personal milestone we have as number one. Feeling so incredibly blessed to celebrate another year of life. Yep. Um, Travel, wanderlust satisfied. Professional update, emotional reflection, brand partnership, social commentary, um, food, family, sports humor. This does the job, right? This is more synthetic data um, based on an existing data set. Now, is this as tuned as you want it to be? Maybe, maybe not. But you can see it's a pretty straightforward exercise to give a language model a training data set and say, make more of this stuff. You'll notice in the training data set that I did not include any of the quantitative data. I'll bring it up on screen here. I just have the qualitative, the unstructured data. I didn't include the quantitative data for a very specific reason. Um, we want this to be focused on these patterns, the patterns in the text, vocabulary, emoji, etc. Now, if you were wanted to create a data set for use with classification, you would probably want data that has defined categories, like this is for a reel or a photo or an album. In that case, you'd want to specify to the language model what example data you have in each category and then have it generate more within each category. Say, make some captions for reels, make some captions for carousels, and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, specificity is important. Right? If you want the best kind of output, you've got to have the cleanest and most well-defined inputs. If you want more really good real content, you've got to include that. When you include quantitative data, it can kind of mess with the model. You want these things to be focused. Language models can interpret numerical data, but as with all generative AI tasks, the more focused your inquiries are, the better the models tend to perform. If you don't need quantitative data in your synthetic data set, don't include it. Now, suppose quantitative data did matter. What would you do then? As you did with the classification data set, you'd want to bin your quantitative data and then generate more of it by bin as a discrete task. For example, your starting data set might be binned into quartiles, 25% increments. Here's the top 25% of Instagram posts in this category, the middle 25%, well, the middle 50%, and then the bottom 25%. You would provide each quartile to the model, say, hey, this is the top 25% Instagram posts, generate more of these. Here's the middle 50% of Instagram posts, generate more of these. Here's the bottom 25%, generate more of these to create a data set that mimics the original. And it would synthesize content plus the quantitative data within that specific range, the range of the bin. For example, if you're saying we need to create synthetic data for Instagram captions from the bottom 25% of the data set, no synthetic post should have more than 15 likes, right? You'd want to be very specific about that. Why wouldn't you do this all at once? Well, again, specificity. The more you can break down a task and make it granular, the better the models are going to perform. You'll note as we're talking about these things for those folks who have some background with statistics, you're going to have to do some pre-processing on these data sets to say like what is the mean or the median of the top 25% of Instagram posts in this example. Doing that homework up front will get you better generated results on the back end as opposed to just throwing it all in and hoping that it works out. So that's the first use case and a half, making more stuff from the stuff you already have. This is the foundation technique, right? You just take the stuff, make sure it's clean, dump it in, make more of it. Today's language models are very capable of doing it very, very well. And the more training data you can provide, the better the models are going to perform. Giving them 10 examples will generate okay results. Giving them 100 examples is better, and 1,000 examples is even better than that. In this training data set, how many examples did we have? We had 3,610 examples of Instagram captions. So it was able to generate um, very good examples because we gave it a lot of data. Let's dig into the second use case, working with data that requires cleaning to remove protected attributes like personally identifying information. Personally identifying information, PII, like email addresses, IP addresses, first names, last names, named entities, company names. These are not things you want to be handing out, especially if you have to hand the data to someone else to work with it who isn't maybe under your NDA or isn't cleared to work with the data. So how would you use generative AI to work with this data? First, using traditional data management techniques, you'd replace all of the existing PII with unique identifiers. There are any number of software libraries and packages capable of doing this. You can even have generative AI write you a script in a language like Python or R to perform this task. You can say, hey, script, go and sanitize this data set, right? Replace names of people and places and things within the unstructured text. Give it placeholders that will allow you to scrub the data and have it be something that you can start to work with. Because if you can't hand it to another person because of its sensitivity, you probably also don't want to be handing it to a generative model, at least a model like one of the free ones that they train on your data, right? Which means you're handing them your data, which means you're probably causing more trouble, right, with that data because you're giving it to a third party. So build that script, run that script, clean out all the identifying information. Once you've sanitized the source data, then you can hand it to generative AI and have it replicate more of it, following the exact same techniques we just did for the Instagram captions. Say, here's my training data set, make more of this stuff. Here's the critical difference. Once you generated the new data set that is based on the original, right, with the same quantitative information if you've got it stuff, you have to remove the original data set. You have to separate it out so that if you hand the data to another analyst or a third party, it is purely synthetic. No original information is in there, right? It'll have the same numerical aspects, statistical patterns, etc., but no source data at all is being handed to a party that's not authorized to view that source data. Really important. You've got to keep them separate from each other and make real sure you don't hand the wrong data set out. Now, let's tackle the thorniest use case of all, synthetic generation of data to work around data you don't have permission to work with. To do this and remain compliant with laws and regulations, you cannot use any source data at all. And thus, generation techniques will generate less accurate data than other techniques that we've discussed because you're not allowed to use that source data. I'm going to position a warning here and say, I'm not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice. Please consult your legal team for legal advice specific to your situation if you are trying to work with synthetic data for data you don't have permission to use. And by the way, the long-term sustainable workaround, get permission to use people's data for machine learning and AI. Now, suppose you wanted to generate some customer interactions for training a language model. What you can't do if you want to be in strict alignment with regulations like GDPR and CPRA and others is use any actual customer data for synthetic generation. You can't provide it training data because that would be a violation of those regulations. What you can do is use your own recall of aggregate information about customers to build a series of synthetic customer profiles, right? You have a Sally soccer mom and Bob the builder and all this stuff, right? There's these personas that you construct from your own knowledge, and then you interact with those personas and have them generate data. You would say, "Hey, Sally, help me make 10 customer profiles of people just like you." As an example, suppose Trust Insights wanted to generate synthetic data about our EU customer base, and we had not obtained customer permissions to use their data for that purpose. How would we do it? We develop a general understanding of that customer base first across our base by talking to our salespeople, talking to our account managers. We could understand the general job titles of people who are customers, the types of personalities that they have in aggregate, not identifying any one person, but in general. Our customers are extraordinarily good looking, right? In general, our customers are very, very smart people. In general, our customers like Celine Dion, right? Whatever we could understand from them. We want to get those characteristics, their affinities, their interests, etc. We could also extract our own data about our customer base as a whole, again, not using customer data, but things like our data, like average deal size for the EU territory, average annual revenue from the EU territory for or a certain market within that. Not using personal information, but using aggregate information. If you're doing this purely B2C, you'd say, well, what's the average household income in France, right? And you could use that, or if you have a lot of, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of customers in a specific region, you would say, what's the average household income in Perpignan, right? Once you've developed that that synthetic understanding, you would start using language models to infer the characteristics of this persona and then creating that data. You would say, here's Sally Soccer Mom model, start generating 10 or 20 or 30 examples of people just like this. To be clear, this is risky. There's a greater risk of hallucination. It will create things that are statistically valid from its own knowledge, but potentially factually incorrect because we're working with anecdotes and assumptions that might not be grounded in fact. There may be biases, right? We talk to our salespeople, and all of our salespeople just happen to hate working with Koreans, right? So they won't remember that detail. It is always better to use actual data than to work off assumptions. But if you have absolutely no access to the data as permitted by law, this would be a short-term workaround until you get real data obtained with the appropriate consent. That last part is the most important part. Purely generated data cobbled together from assumptions is not a long-term solution. It is a stopgap measure that lets you start building with data. Right? If you say, hey, we're going to be building this model for doing chatbots, you would want to use this synthetic data set as your starting point while the real data flows in, right? Because you want that real data with the appropriate permissions to ground your synthetic data generation in reality. And you may not need much. You may need 5 or 10% of your customer base, but you've got to have that data. You can't go off these assumptions forever. One of the things that tends to happen is that practices become institutionalized. So make sure that as you're developing this purely synthetic data cobbled together from assumptions, that you put a very strict expiration date on. You say, we are doing this until we have data from this date onward, so that to retire your purely synthetic, purely generated data at a certain point because you've now done the hard work to get permission to use real data. So, synthetic data sets solve for a lot of problems in AI and data science, but sometimes those solutions are stopgaps until you fix the real problem, like user consent. Other times, they're the only solution, like insufficient volume of data, right? AI is so hungry for data that we have machines making more of the data that we have, that like the data that exists, until we can backfill it with real stuff. What's most important is that you're clear on the problem you're trying to solve before you use synthetic data so that you get the right approach, right? So you take the right approach, you don't break any laws, et cetera, et cetera. Shameless plug, if you want help with synthetic data, again, this is literally something my company does. So link in the newsletter if you want to get in touch about how to do this in more detail. All right, what else happened this week? Been reminding people the Generative AI for Marketers course just recently updated. We did a really fun live stream this week on using AI for SEO, and it's not your traditional like, oh, just do this, write this kind of post. It's actually, I thought, much more interesting about using generative AI for some of the ideation, for some of the technical stuff and things. So go watch the live stream. There's a link in the newsletter for it. Also had a piece on the role of AI in role of PR in the age of AI. Short, the TLDR. PR is really important in the age of AI, but you got to do it right. Some stuff on intentional inefficiency and a few other things. So go check that stuff out. Reminder at the top of the newsletter as well. I just did a webinar on generative AI for agencies. So if you work at an agency or you're thinking about working in an agency, go check that out. It's free. It's like a 55 minutes. We'll cover a lot of very specific use cases. Let's take a look at jobs. Who's hiring this week? Digital Communications and External Affairs Associate at the Aspen Institute, Digital Communications Manager at Giving Tuesday, Executive Director at Trans Lifeline, Head of Marketing at Cloverleaf, Officer of Digital Strategy at OSF Global, Principal Campaign Manager at Calendly, Product Marketing Manager at Attentive, Senior Content Marketing Manager at Modern Health, Senior Email and Lifecycle Operations Manager at Calendly, Senior Social Media Manager at Duolingo. What if you get to like pretend to have the owl like yell at people? That'd be kind of funny. Social Creative Director at Adobe and Senior SDE Backend at Recharge Payments. In other news this week, lots of talk about, huge surprise, generative AI. Yeah, that's pretty much all that's in the news this week. Big stuff that happened recently. The Llama 3 models are scoring wicked high on user feedback forums on the chatbot arena, which is really surprising that an open model can do that. And Apple released its open ELM model this week, which is the first one that I know of its size and capability where they gave away the training data that made the model. So it's a true open source model. You can look at the materials that were used to make the model, make changes to that so that you can then make your own version of the model that maybe has a very specific purpose. Some very cool stuff. Upcoming events, the Australian Food and Grocery Association, it's Food and Grocery Australia, which is in a couple of weeks. Society for Marketing Professional Services in Los Angeles, a 2-day workshop with my friends in the AEC community. Macon, the Marketing AI Conference in Cleveland in September, and the Marketing Process B2B Forum in Boston in November, and have another event in September, just waiting to get the name of the event so I can post it in there as well. That is also food and beverage stuff. So, that is the newsletter for this week. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being here. I look forward to hearing how you're using synthetic data sets if you're trying to manufacture your own. And if you are, love to hear about your success stories and things. Feel free to hit reply or leave a comment in the comment section. Thanks for tuning in. I'll talk to you next time. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And if you want to know when new videos are available, hit the bell button to be notified as soon as new content is live.